I, 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 I. He got fired from Kane, now we ain't got no shame. So we started a pod, Chuck Yates needs a job.
Hey everybody, welcome to Chuck Yates Needs a Job, the podcast. You just missed the most compelling 27 minutes of a podcast ever recorded. I've been sitting here with my guest, JJ Anselmi, who wrote this really cool book about Rock Spring, Wyoming. We're getting into it. We're talking about suicide, corn, all of this, and your dumb shit host didn't push the record button. But now the record button has been pushed. And anyway, nice visiting with you, JJ.
Yeah. See you later, man. No worries, dude. The story of tech, man. It's all good.
Yeah. Well, JJ, do this. I hate to make you repeat yourself, but tell me who you are.
Sure.
We were introduced by Michael Patrick Smith, the good hand, who had written a book. And you were kind enough to send me a copy of your book, which I actually read. I've got a goal of reading one book a month this year. So check the box. I've done it once, but I was trying to figure out who you are, and it kind of says writer, grew up in Rock Spring, rock dude. So
yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Before I was ever a writer, I was a little, heavy metal Hessian kid. I think that music, really grabbed me, having grown up in a boomtown, which is, as you know, the subject of the book. That music just always kind of made sense to me on a deep level. When I kind of found it when I was 12 and 13, which I think is when you really start stepping into your own as a fan, and you start really like developing tastes that aren't shaped by your parents necessarily.
Circa what year are you, 12 or 13? When is that?
Yeah. Wait, so I was born in 85. So let's see how fucking horrible my math is. So 97, I was 12.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're kind of the second half of the 90s coming in. And so you missed Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. And we had this world where literally the number one song in America was Every Rose Has Its Thorn by Poison, and all the glam metal guys wore makeup and hair, and all of a sudden these dudes show up in plaid shirts and they sound like Black Sabbath, and all. So who was? So you're 12, you're 13. You were kind of throwing out earlier when we were talking that you like Black Sabbath and the like. But who was kind of your jam? What sort of got you into music?
Yeah, man, I knew Sabbath and some kind of random stuff I'd see on the radio, and I did know Nirvana. I grew up watching MTV, and at like, in retrospect, what seems kind of its golden age of like when you could just turn on the TV and actually discover new music. It had a productive element to it. It wasn't just shitty reality TV, which is super entertaining, but I think there's more value in what they used to do. But yeah, man, the first thing that really hit home with me in a huge way, where I was like, this is my favorite band. I was writing their name on every notebook. I had to have every shirt. It was Korn for sure.
Oh, cool. Have you seen the Netflix special on Woodstock 99?
I haven't watched that one, but I watched the HBO series. And I remember when Woodstock 99 happened, and just like how much as, a 14-year-old kid, I wished I could have been there. And then of course I'm like, you're so lucky that you had nothing to do with that, because what a fucking nightmare, man.
I mean, check out that Woodstock 99. It's actually a great watch. It's a perfect, just kind of turn it on and just watch one night. But the back to back of Limp Bizkit going crazy, and look, Cheese Boy right here. I love me some Limp Bizkit.
Totally.
And then followed up with Korn. I mean, just the way they threw the crowd into the tizzy was just amazing.
Oh, it's nuts. That footage when Korn starts that first song it's unforgettable, dude. And I think that song itself is fucking insane in its own right. But man, yeah, you're right. And it's funny in the other documentary how the promoters just still refuse to take any responsibility for like creating just this horrible disaster of a festival where people were literally bathing in shit, and waters were like $10 in 99, which is like fucking crazy. And they
Yeah.
still blame it all. They're like, that Fred Durst. I'm like, shut the fuck. Fred Durst did what he was supposed to do, dude.
Yeah, Fred Durst did. So this is kind of wild you bring up corn, because I've got a corn story, and I don't think I've ever shared this with the podcast before. And so I'll just kind of lay it out on you because it's a crazy story, and it kind of will wrap into your book. So this is, call it 8 years ago. I'm going through a separation, which ultimately, unfortunately, wound up in divorce. I'm in couples counseling with my wife. And anyway, we go to couples counseling on a Monday. It's 57 minutes into our 60-minute session when my ex-wife's like, "Hey, I need to tell you something. I filed for divorce this morning." And I was like, "Well, what?"
Yeah.
But I was supposed to get on a plane in a couple hours and go fundraise. So I was going to be out of town that week raising money. And me, Kim, therapist, all just decided, okay, go out of town and we'll just deal with this when we get back. Maybe the break will be good. So devastated, distraught, all that stuff. I get on a plane, I sit down, guy sits next to me. And what's weird is a really good friend of mine got on the plane and sat literally the row behind me. So I'm
Okay.
kind of sitting there, and this guy turns to me and says, "Hey, did you know I almost died? I was literally 5 minutes from death, and this amazing thing happened that saved my life." And I was
Oh,
like, "Well,
shit.
given that we just met, no, I didn't know that, but lay it on me." So he tells this amazing story about getting sick. He had to go to the hospital. The doctor said you need surgery. OR just happened to open up that afternoon. He got surgery. When they got in, the surgeon was like, "You die if you get surgery in 2 weeks." It's this crazy tale.
Yeah.
Anyway, just this amazing story. And I really wanted to share with this guy. This guy's name was Eric. He seemed like a great guy, but my buddy's sitting right behind me. So
Right.
anyway, we get off the plane. My buddy walks off, and I turn to Eric. I go, "Hey, man, my wife filed for divorce this morning. Thank you for talking to me. I'm sorry I couldn't share. It was just, that's a really good friend of mine." And Eric looks at me and he goes, "Hey, Chuck, do you know how many times in my 27 years I have talked to the person next to me on a plane?" And I said, "Nah." And he goes, "Never. You're the
Wow.
first person I've ever talked to on a plane. And I did it because God told me I needed to talk to you." And I was like, "Okay." So we actually kind of said a prayer, and he was really cool. He wound up babysitting me for a year or two going through the divorce. But the
Wow.
reason I tell that story is the tie-in with Korn is Brian Welch, who I think we were talking earlier. You said he goes by Head. That's
Yeah.
his nickname in the band. The guitar player tells the story in his autobiography about sitting at a computer ready to end it all. I don't know if there's a gun there or whatever, but
Right.
the situation's pretty dire. And he got an email from his best friend, a guy named Eric.
Yeah.
And Eric said, "God told me to tell you that I love you." And Brian kind of freaks out. What the hell? Or is it, calls Eric, "What the hell are you doing?" And Eric's just like, "Man, God told me to tell you I love you." Anyway, Brian, of course, winds up going to church, turning his life around, getting straight off drugs. I
Yeah.
think in the autobiography, the email is even, one of the pictures. I got this email, it saved my life. And that's the
Wow.
guy, Eric. And
Crazy.
anyway, so it was just crazy.
Yeah, it's gnarly. And dude, yeah, there's, as much of an atheist as I like to say that I am, yeah, those distress calls that go out into the universe, it seems real to me, man. I mean, to get into a real example real fast, when I was, as you can tell just from reading the jacket copy of my book, there's a super high suicide rate where I'm from and in Wyoming as a whole. And I definitely, grappled with a lot of thoughts, in that direction when I was like 19 and 20, especially. And I, as a typical dude, and I never said anything about it to anybody and really tried to play it cool. But I remember my best friend just like totally randomly one day, it felt like a total non sequitur for like what we were talking about. And he just said something about like, essentially like, you shouldn't ever think about that. And it was similar of like, the subtext was like, I love you, dude, and people love you. And it just, man, it stuck with me as like a, whoa, what the fuck, moment of, I still think I'm an atheist, but I don't know, dude. If you would have asked me if I was an atheist when I was like 16, I would say like, yeah, fuck, whatever. But now I'm like, yeah, I guess, man, I don't fucking know. Yeah.
Well, so I've got the world's greatest priest. I go to an Episcopal church, and his name's Patrick. He's actually been on the podcast a couple of times. Amazing guy, down to earth guy. We'd love to have him on the podcast with us because he likes music and all that. But anyway, I was telling him the story about Eric, and I'm just like, man, that was amazing. I really needed it, and God sent me an angel, and this guy was just perfect. And Patrick looks at me and goes, "Hey, man, if God's going to send an angel, usually really fucking good. God knows what he's doing on this shit." So, yeah. Well, do this kind of talk to me about Rock Springs, why you wrote the book, growing up there. Cause, like I said, it was a great read. I enjoyed reading it.
Well, thanks, man. So, Rock Springs, I think the older I get, the more I see of just like, it seems like such an American place, and yeah, I think everything about it, from its ups and its downs, its positives and its negatives, are just so American to me. And so anyway, the town, started in the late 1800s. This dude who's doing some, geological surveys, they found some coal in the area, and it was kind of, couple of years later is when Union Pacific was deciding where they would lay tracks, through Wyoming, and there was coal there, so it only made sense that they would do that because UP used to be a big coal player for a long time. I don't know if they still have any stake in that or whatever, but so yeah, coal was really the deciding factor in that town even existing as a settlement, and that's
Whereabouts in Wyoming are we? Kind of
southwest.
Southwest. Okay.
Yeah. So just to paint a picture, it's not the it's not Jackson Hole in Yellowstone, I think, which is the popular, like, when you say Wyoming, that's kind of what people tend to think of, and it's super pretty up there, and it's just kind of crushingly beautiful. But where I'm from, it ain't like that. It's more yeah, man, from, like East Texas type shit of like just plains and lots of wind. But then it gets cold as fuck. And so you get, the cold plus the wind chill in the winters, and it'll drop down to like 20 degrees below zero. More, my dad texted me the other day and he said it'd gone to like 40 degrees below zero, which is just fucked up. Yeah,
that is.
Yeah. And so it's not like the Yellowstone type things. It's way more like open spaces, prairie, plains. And so, yeah, man, is a coal mining town. And, since it wasn't really aesthetically pleasing in a lot of ways, the people who wound up there in a lot of ways were, either like laborers in the coal mines and stuff, or people who were kind of had services for those laborers pretty much. And I think that's kind of been the heart of the town for a long time. And there's some crazy shit that happened. UP was employing a bunch of Chinese immigrants in the late 1800s, and they just figured, like, why not just throw them in here with this mix of like all these other types of people in Wyoming and see how it goes. And of course, it didn't fucking go well, So there was this pretty brutal racial riot in the late 1800s there. And so the town has always had this kind of violent, kind of tinge to it. And I think there was that happened. And then, which was 1885. And then from there, it was kind of a standard Western coal mining boomtown. I think when I watched Deadwood, a lot of that kind of rang true to me because it was like, you get a lot of prostitution and just kind of Wild West type shit, man, of people who kind of want to do whatever they want to do and can do it in these types of places because there's not as many people. And you end up getting a lot more men than women, which is kind of like why the prostitution ends up going in there. And so there's a lot of factors. That was kind of a standard coal mining town for a long time. But then in the 70s, it went through this huge boom, which is really where my kind of story starts in a lot of ways, because it's when my parents met. And that's like during that boom is like why my mom's family even moved there in the first place. And so in a lot of ways, I'm a child of that boom, of that 70s boom, which was, there was this huge coal-fueled power plant that opened just outside town that created just a shitload of jobs and really high paying jobs. It's you could suddenly make a living that's like comparable, if not higher than a lot of people if they had a college degree, and it's like just straight out of high school, or even without graduating high school, you can make some damn good money out there in the mines. Or my dad was in the warehouse, and then he dumped a lot of they had to dump all this like coal ash that after they would burn it. And so that was his job for a long time. And yeah, man, it's just a gnarly town. And, during that 70s boom, you just got more of the prostitution and drugs, and it ended up capturing the interest of Dan Rather in 60 Minutes, because suddenly here's this little town in Wyoming that is, has a lot going on. There's a street through town called K Street where there's essentially open prostitution, and it was kind of allowed by the old timers to exist. And Dan Rather caught wind of that and, went there with 60 Minutes and they ended up doing 2 episodes in 77 about it. And, man, it's a shitty reporting. It's really bad reporting.
Well, most of the time it is. I, my fellow Texan Dan Rather, I'm not a big fan of. But
yeah.
What I found kind of interesting reading about this small town, the prostitution, is I went in kind of with the lens of this is an extraction story.
Totally.
And this boom and bust cycle happens to all these towns, and you get all of the prostitution, the drugs, etc., and you build infrastructure that then when the bust happens doesn't get supported. And, isn't there a better way for us to handle extraction type stuff?
Totally.
But then trying to be intellectually honest, I grew up in a small town in Texas, Richmond. I live there today. It's about 25 miles outside of Houston. We had Mud Alley. I mean, the administration, if you will, in Richmond kind of said, you stay on that side of the tracks. We won't do anything about it.
Totally.
And so we had a little bit of that too. Texas had the famous chicken ranch in LaGrange that we did the movie on and that ZZ Top sang about. And so I was torn between this extraction story versus, no, this is kind of the story of America. And truth be told, it's probably all of that.
It really is, man. Yeah, it really is all that. And yeah, it's, I don't think it was unique. And I know a lot of people who have, in that way, especially compared to a lot of Texas towns, I know a lot of buddies and shit like that who moved to Texas because, their experiences in oil field tech or whatever they do, and they can find a lot. I know a lot of people have ended up finding good jobs in Texas, but yeah, the way it happened in Rock Springs was just so fucking extreme. And I think that boom was huge in itself. It was just like suddenly the population of the town literally doubled overnight. And so you just have this town of like, there's very limited housing and apartments available and shit like that. So dudes are making a ton of money, but then you have guys who are just like living on top of each other in these little trailers and shit like that, or just living in tents, and trying to find a good job and shit like that. And the Dan Rather coverage really took it in a strange direction, because you could really see like what happens when national media coverage descends on a small town. And to me, it was like an invasive species, and because after that coverage, then the local officials were embarrassed and essentially said, okay, we have to crack down on this we can't just let the prostitution exist as openly anymore, and we have to look like we're doing something, because right now they felt they had been made to look kind of stupid or just kind of greasy or whatever. And so they ended up bringing in this dude named Ed Cantrell, and he was like this just this tough ass little cowboy sheriff, and they kind of tasked him with cleaning up the town, and he was really, yeah, I think he did it in a lot of ways. Or and how authorities and officials are. There's always like a million layers behind the person who's doing the action. So of course it wasn't just Cantrell, and there's a lot of people pulling the strings and shit like that. But Cantrell ended up bringing in this dude, Michael Rosa, an undercover narcotics agent who had lived in New York, to kind of help get rid of some of that shit. And then their relationship just exploded and went south. And long story short, Ed Cantrell ended up shooting his own undercover agent in the back of a car. Not that long after those 60 Minutes episodes came out. And so it's been just this like, I think, yeah, you're right. The Boomtown and Extraction stories are all there, but the way Rock Springs has experienced it is so extreme, man. But I think that's why it's good to use the town as a lens, because then you can really see like, okay, here's what happens when we truly when our only source of our economy is extraction. Like, here's really some of the paths and stuff and it can take. And of course, there's so many layers. Like I said, I think the Dan Rather shit it reminds me of like when you have, kind of somebody older in your family and they discover YouTube and Facebook, and like the effect that has on people. I think the 60 Minutes episodes were like that to people, because even people in town believed all the shit. They just believed everything that Dan Rather was kind of presenting to them, even though a lot of it was like super sensationalized and out of context and all that stuff.
The thing one kind of like side note just for history that in the book was, so Cantrell goes to trial and he was defended by Gary Spence. I mean,
yeah,
the world famous defense lawyer. So
yeah, well, that was, I think, as far as I know, that was a case that got Jerry, made him famous. And as I tried to interview him, but I ended up interviewing his stepson, who's a really cool dude named Chris Hawks. And, he had such an interesting, just different take on Cantrell than because then, of course, once the Cantrell murder happened, then the media came back in, and, there was like an A&E on it, and you had like New York Times doing coverage on the murder and stuff like that. But I think a lot of it was really easy to just kind of dismiss Cantrell as a murderer, and then see, Spence getting him off as like, oh, classic good old boy shit. But talking to Chris Hawks, man, it was just such this good nuance to the story of like who Ed Cantrell actually was. And he was talking about like just growing up with the dude on the ranch and learning how to kind of handle a ranch from the guy, and stuff like that really give a human element that, I think is kind of missing when you just focus on those big sensational stories.
So something I was thinking reading the book, and maybe there is no answer to this, maybe you got a take on it. It just seems like, you have the boom cycle of the extraction, and you get the flood of people in.
Yeah.
And one of the things Michael Patrick Smith and I talked about when he came on the podcast is, Navy SEALs actually look for applicants that have had a lot of trauma in their life, that were abused, because they are used to running on 100% adrenaline all the time. And that serves you really well as a Navy SEAL.
Right.
And to some degree, Michael had a theory that the oil field was similar, because it's a dangerous freaking job. I mean, you can die at any moment. It's very challenging. So people that can run on adrenaline are probably really good out there. So a lot of times the people he was hanging out with in the bar, I mean, they were turning off the adrenaline, drinking and the like. So I get kind of, you get the boom, you get the money, you draw people like that into the community.
Totally.
Was there not an element, though, of being able to draw a line where that's the boom and the bust will go away, but us longtime residents here that live here are going to, in the boom time, take some money aside, get our kids to college, and have
Right.
a normal life? Or does it just so dominate the culture of a city that you can't do anything about it?
I think yeah, there is. It was cool to talk to some longtime residents, and they were like, you know, in all honesty, all that stuff going on didn't really affect us that much, and I think that was cool. But then you got to think too. A lot of people who call that place home are kind of the type of dudes that you're talking about who can really function in these like super dangerous industrial jobs and do a good job with it and not get themselves and everyone else killed. And then, you have that kind of like super intense work experience, and then you're trying to find some way to turn it off. And really that's kind of, even when the boom goes away, that's still the economy there, and the labor of like working in coal mines and shit like that. And so I think a lot of the town's residents are really like those, that type of people too, of like, man, me and my dad's friends, or me and my friends' dads, who came of age during that boom, they just never really learned how to turn that, how to like go into mellow mode, because yeah, I think the adrenaline would get pumping when they're partying too. And it's just extremes from every angle. And they kind of have a hard time like trying to find some kind of quiet space in their own minds, I guess.
Another thing I thought cool, kind of, that may have worked into that dynamic, and this almost sounds silly to say, but I actually was believing it, particularly when I was reading it, is the wind. I
Yeah,
mean,
dude.
just the freaking wind
Yeah.
drives you crazy. I need to go drink this off,
Yeah. Yeah. So that's just another whole other beast in itself of like, so you have all this labor and the partying and stuff that naturally goes with it. And then you take into account that the wind is just knocking you on your ass constantly. And even if it's in the middle of the summer and warm and you're getting blasted by wind, it's, it's not usually that super fun to go out into. And then especially during the winter when you get any wind and it starts, dropping the temperatures down with the wind chill, and it really starts getting into the like negative 20s and 30s. And my dad texted me the other day and said it was into the negative 40s, which is extreme, but not totally like out of my experience of it for sure. Yeah, I think that's really going to press you to be indoors, and if you can find a constructive way to deal with like all that indoors time, good on you. But I don't think it's hard, it's really hard, man, to deal with that boredom. And a lot of people do just, look for it in the bottle or needle or kind of whatever it is.
I was like, I got it because one time I went to Homer, Alaska for 4 or 5 days, and I went July 4th.
Okay.
And so anyway, we land in Homer. Buddy's playing in a bar, his band, so we go see it. And they, this is Alaska, so they play till 1 a.m, right? And
Right.
I'm sitting there, on vacation, pounding away at vodka. I walk outside and it's perfectly sunny, right?
That's
I
fucking weird.
mean, they have sun, I think, 23 hours a day during the summer. And I swore off vodka for 2 years because I'm like, holy shit, I'm seeing,
Yeah.
but you hear about how the darkness during the winter
Yep.
induces a lot of the same thing you're talking about: anxiety, have to be inside, it's cold,
Yep.
find things to do. And hell, the sun kind of did it to me for 4 days, and I like sunshine.
Yeah, man. And I don't think, considering that kind of extreme environment, that it's any coincidence that Alaska and Wyoming are always kind of going back and forth for who has the highest suicide rate of any state in the country, man. And I think that's an unfortunate reality of all those things. And if it's not just the environment, then again, you get those harsh jobs and it busts your ass, man. Literally, my dad's back is just like totally fucked up. And it was at a pretty young age for him, in his kind of early 50s when he had herniated discs in his back and couldn't really work out there anymore. And that's a pretty common, Rock Springs story. And so again, it's just all these swirling factors that intermingle. And then the result is, you get a lot of suicide and addiction, man.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I'm sorry, I'm like putting you under the spotlight on the book review here, but
No worries.
another thought I had reading the book, and there were definitely some elements, some evidence, but if you made me give you an answer to this question, do the people actually, despite its problems, love Rock Springs? I don't know what the answer would be to that. So I'd love to hear your take on what you think people would say to that.
I think the answer is yes. And to me, that was one of the biggest gifts that I got from this book project because, to kind of back up into my own youth as a kid, listening to metal, I fucking hated growing up there, man. It was, because you don't understand all these historical contexts and, kind of like the social and economic factors of why it is like it is and stuff like that. And so, as a kid, I was just like, I fucking hate this place, dude. I do not like this. Me and my friends, our dads partied. And so like our way of rebelling was to be straight edge, which is, is funny and, not built to last for sure. But, I think, considering all those things and like the chip on my shoulder I've carried with me for years and even well into my 20s, writing this book and talking to people who just went through the craziest fucking trauma, there from suicidal ideation to like all of us have known just multiple people who've killed themselves, which is to me, just that's kind of one thing I realized like when I first moved away from Rock Springs. I remember having the realization of like, dude, it's not normal to know like I've known a dozen people who've killed themselves, not all close friends necessarily, but at least acquaintances. And more than half of those were people who were directly in my life and shit like that. And I realized that was not normal. I was like, man, that is weird. That is very strange. But when you're there, it's part of the culture. It's like what everybody grows up with. And so long story short, I had a big chip on my shoulder about the place, man. And, I've seen some loved ones go through some just gnarly shit there. And I think that chip on the shoulder is, understandable in a lot of ways. But as I was doing the interviews from this book and hearing from people who experienced way worse trauma than I ever did or could even really imagine, invariably people would say toward the end, like, that place made me resilient as shit. And not only that, it teaches you to kind of, it really gives you like a DIY ethic in a lot of ways, because you have to learn to make something out of nothing. Like, the music scene when we were young was a perfect example of like, there was no punk or metal scene. And what we created might've been like laughable to people in cities, but we fucking did it ourselves, man. There's a lot of value in those lessons and shit like that. And people I talked to invariably said like, I would not want to have grown up in another place. And to me, like, you had, it's mind blowing to hear that from people who like, they're talking about just this crazy homophobia, growing up as a gay kid there, just like gnarly racism and just this constant barrage of negative shit like that. And still at the end of the interview, they're like, I would not want to be from anywhere else. And I think really that's the gift that I've carried with me after this project of like, I think I've always been proud to be from Wyoming and from Rock Springs. But after that, I'm like, dude, I'm so thankful to be from there and not just like, I live in Long Beach, California now. And, it's in LA County. And I'm just so grateful that I know how to cope with like, not a lot going on, or like, you can just always do something for yourself and it just gives you a different perspective. I think it really came in handy during COVID,
That's interesting because when I read the book, and you know, when I read the book, I could detect some, but I loved it here because that's said a few times during the book, or I'm glad I'm from here. I didn't see that come out, and that may have just been me missing it. So that's really cool to hear because I almost saw it as a little bit of Stockholm syndrome.
Sure.
We were all in this horrible place, and we didn't know any better. That's why we're glad we were from there. So it's cool to hear you say that because I do totally believe that growing up in my small town, Richmond, Texas, we all got along. We were about 50% Hispanic, 25% Black, 25% white.
That's
We all
awesome.
got along pretty well. And I think it was because we were so terrorized by the football coaches. I mean, they used every
Oh,
racial slur they could at
damn.
all of us. I mean, they would
Right.
call me the N word. I was like, what, huh? What is it? But they all yelled at us. So we all had to bind together. It's like,
Totally.
yeah. So no, that's interesting to hear because
Yeah,
very
man,
very
and it's in the last chapter is called What We've Learned from the Sagebrush, and it's really dedicated to that stuff. And I think even the sagebrush is like the main plant life there, it's like a lot of plains and you can see forever and it can seem kind of bleak, but you really have to just learn how to look at it from a different perspective. And to me now, I'm like, sagebrush is not only pretty, but it's just this tough motherfucking plant, like sagebrush can take whatever the fuck you throw at it, dude. So I think in a lot of ways, the people who grow up there, you're kind of like the sagebrush. You have to be resilient, and like, man, what a quality to have as a human adult, if you can be resilient, dude, that's life in a lot of ways.
that's really cool to hear. I worry about my kids growing up because my kids have been handed everything,
Sure.
humanly possible, great education and all that. And I think it was Kinky Friedman that said the worst preparation for life is a happy childhood, and there's a lot of truth in that. So JJ, do this for me. I'm gonna throw the book in front of the camera so people can see the cover. Give us the name, give us where people can get it,
Sure.
and give us your plug on the book.
Yeah, man. So the book is called Out Here on Our Own, an oral history of an American boomtown. Written by me, JJ Anselmi. And then I was lucky enough to collaborate with this super talented photographer named Jordan Utley, which was kind of when I was working on the project, and it like fell into place that Jordan could take photographs for it. It was like that final puzzle piece, man. But yeah, it's I think my first book is a memoir about growing up in Rock Springs. So it's yeah.
Yeah, the photography was awesome.
Oh yeah, man. And you can go to his site, Jordan Utley, and see some of that stuff, more blown up, and order prints, or, if that strikes your fancy. But my first book was a, memoir of growing up in Rock Springs. And it definitely is more of that kind of like chip on your shoulder type perspective, which I wrote it when I was, I was like 26 to like 29 when I wrote it. So I was pretty young still, And then this book, it's all other people's stories. And so it's just, to me, a really fun project to work on. And that like, I was doing interviews with all these people that some of them I knew and then some of them I didn't. And then, we really got to know each other on a different level. And man, when people are telling me some of their stories about kind of like what I mentioned of what it was like to grow up as a Black kid there, what it's like to grow up as a gay kid, and a place where it was like pretty clear that, you weren't welcome in a lot of ways from some people, not from everybody, of course, but I think the impact ends up happening, unfortunately, from some shitty people. But when people are telling me those stories, I was just like, damn, dude, this isn't just my story anymore. This is like dead fucking serious of these people trusting me with their stories. And So they're trusting me to try and put it into this book to actually capture where we're from. And hopefully I did it. But yeah, they seem to have liked it, man. But I was, it was intense in a lot of ways for sure. Because like I said, those stories aren't mine, dude. Those experiences,
And I guess now I'm kind of up to, I've probably done 100 of these podcasts or so, and I do another one called BDE, Big Digital Energy. We call it the summary of the energy business for people that think Jim Cramer sucks.
Sure.
But, so I've done maybe 100 of those as well. The 200 podcasts I've done, I've become incredibly convinced that oral histories are a unique medium. They just are.
They really are.
And actually, oral histories where multiple people are sharing the stories, either collaborating or in the same room or whatever, is really powerful stuff and definitely needs to be captured. So I love the fact you did that in the book.
Thanks, man. And like you said, I mean, as you all know, there's some real human connection that happens during the interviews and all that stuff that is just so valuable. And, I was doing these interviews I came up with the idea to do it as a or to tell the story of the town as an oral history in like late 2019. And then, the shit happened. And I originally planned to go back to Wyoming in summer of 2020 and do all the interviews. And in all honesty, I probably would have done it if my wife also got pregnant like during the early part of that summer. So at that point, I was like, there's no fucking way I'm like jeopardizing anything that's going on the home front. And so I did all the interviews by phone. And man, during that isolation, to feel connected with people from my hometown and just hearing their experiences of like, I knew a lot of the people, like I said, and, was friends with a lot of people and knew some acquaintances and stuff were dealing with racism and stuff like that. But actually hearing the stories, man, I was like, holy fuck, dude, I had no idea it was like that. And I think through that we became closer, I think it's healing for a lot of people. Hopefully, I know it's healing for me. And man, what a process to do a book versus, like otherwise you're literally alone at your desk, kind of just writing or like doing some research and stuff. But otherwise writing is a pretty, it doesn't have to, it's no brainer that it's a pretty solitary exercise. So I think to actually make it social was really cool. It was also like, so many moving pieces and shit like that. I'm working on some novels now because I want to get back to the solitary shit for a little while, but I will probably write another oral history someday.
Yeah, no, the kind of the thing I'll close on, because you just teed it up perfectly, literally came from early in the book. I think Thomas Cullen said, I grew up with the feeling that it was somehow disloyal to harbor thoughts of leaving Rock Springs.
Yeah,
and,
man.
That's that kind of personal connection that even bad shit and all this going on, I still felt enough of a connection that I didn't want to leave, or at least talk about leaving.
Yeah, his story was so cool. And talk about like, people say like Rock Springs will always be there for its own. And I really saw that time and again in this project. And that like, once I knew to write an oral history, I was like, well, how the fuck do I cover like the early 1900s as an oral history? Who was alive during then, And so the local museum let me use huge portions from a book they published, which is Thomas Cullen's book. It's like, man, what a fucking cool Rock Springs thing that they did that. And his experiences are just like you said, it's so cool that he found that pride and the value, and his experience is no joke, dude. His dad was going into those old school coal mines where they're hauling the shit out with fucking horses. And like, death is just constant from the cave-ins. And I think one of the things that I will never forget in his memoir that I included in my book was he talked about the miner's tattoos. And it was what he would say with his dad is that, like they had all these small cuts on their hands, but then the coal dust would get in there and heal in their skin. So it looked like a bunch of little tiny tattoos. It's like, what a fucking cool metaphor for the place, dude.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wild. Well, dude, you were really cool to come on the podcast. It was great to talk about, and I really enjoyed the book. And I would encourage anyone that listen, go grab it. Where can we get it? Amazon, all the typical places.
Yeah, typical places, Amazon, or if you want to support indie bookstores, bookshop.org is always a good one. You can also get it directly from the publisher, Bison Books, which is through University of Nebraska. But yeah, thanks so much, Chuck. I've been excited to come on this, and especially from somebody from the industry, from the actual oil and gas industry. And I've done some research listening to your other podcasts, and it's fascinating, man. What a fucking crazy industry. And I'd love to hear more about your experience at some point, man, of just
Yeah, let's do it. I'll get out to California and we'll go grab a beer, because the one thing I do believe about our industry, and I don't know if I'm in the majority, or I'm in the minority, but I will say this is, look, bad shit happens in oil and gas.
Yeah,
It
totally.
does a lot of good, and I think getting kind of all of the stories out
Yeah,
and being honest and being real with it is the best thing we can do to
totally.
protect our industry. I think if we cover things up,
Yeah,
or we sweep it under the rug, or we put a litmus test on people, unless this guy, votes Republican and is pro-life and does this and this, we're not going to support, that
right.
person. We're going to wind up with a tent that has like 12 people in it supporting oil and gas.
Totally.
So I love hearing this story, because, extraction and the boom bust, I mean, we can't run from that. We got to own that in our
No,
industry. It's just, that's what we do. And it doesn't mean
right.
we shouldn't try to learn from it and do better next time.
Totally, man. And I don't think I'm not one of those people who totally says like, yeah, I really, especially the older I get, I try and see those positives. And man, I think, kind of like hydraulic fracturing and shale, the thing I keep coming back to is just that makes a lot of sense to me is American energy security. And so really like you got to weigh, like, are we going to develop our own shit? And like you said, like we got to look at all the negatives that come with it, because there are negatives like anything else in life. Or do we continue to be just totally dependent on, places like Saudi Arabia and shit that are just very unpredictable, and they don't have the
And
U.S. best interest at heart,
And I will say this too: they do not produce the product to the same standards we do in terms of cleanliness and
Makes
focus on the
sense.
environment. And as I always say on the podcast, when it comes to the atmosphere, there's not a peeing and a non-peeing portion of the pool.
Totally.
I mean, it's one. If you produce it in America, great. If you produce it in Saudi Arabia, you've probably produced it a little dirtier.
Yeah,
So.
definitely, man. And I really, take that stuff into account. And I am I'm still kind of liberal leftist or whatever. Although it seems like we're on a similar page of like, I'm so fucking done with division, dude. I don't want to. I'm
Yeah.
so sick of division. I love America, man. I really love to talk to people, and I believe in what America is and can be. And anyway, yes, but I think natural gas is a huge component of like, you can tie that in with the renewals and have all these tiny pieces working together, or renewables, and have these pieces working together to create something that in the end is better for us as a people,
And my point is, it's so important that we ought to have an intellectually honest discussion of the trade-offs. You know,
Yeah,
and
totally.
and a pro oil and gas guy ought to be honest about, hey, we do cause pollution. We are, putting CO2 in the air. The other side ought to be, hey, you do a lot of good. I mean,
Yeah,
you want to
it
talk
really
about the
is.
world being a better place? It really has to do with cheap energy, and
Yep.
how do we balance that coming forward? Because my political leanings are I'm kind of a diehard libertarian, but I also
Sure.
truly believe that rules and regulations and all that need to be a political type process that
Yep.
has buy-in from a lot of people. And so
Totally.
I need to give you something for us to compromise. That way we
Yep.
all buy into it. If you
Yeah.
jam stuff down at 50.1% every time, people don't buy in and you lose faith in the whole system itself. And that's really bad.
It really
So,
is. And I think,
yeah.
unfortunately, that's seems to be where we are, in America. And I hope things get better. But yeah, man, like I said, that's one of the reasons I was really excited to come on here is I knew, you know, I'm sick of echo chambers, not only division, but I'm also sick of just echo chambers where we won't talk to each other and we only want to have our own beliefs reinforced. And I'm like, that's not how we get smarter, man. And that's not good for you, I don't think, to
No,
just have your own beliefs reinforced.
that's no, that's absolutely right. Because the echo chamber can lead to a lot of dopamine being produced in your brain.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we all know too much dopamine's a bad thing. I mean, it
Yeah.
just is.
Yeah, man. I tried out the Mastodon thing as like, stuff was happening with I never thought Twitter was going to go away. I never believed that, but I was just curious about Mastodon because, the idea is that it can't be bought out, by somebody like Elon Musk because it has so many servers. And I've been on there. I'm like, good God, dude, this is a fucking leftist echo chamber like no other, man. And that's coming from a little socialist democratic kid, dude, I have my little socialist hat and stuff that I believe all that shit, but I'm like, good God, dude, this is a fucking horrible echo chamber.
that's that's so funny, and I probably should whisper this and stand it, but some of my energy loud proud brethren are the same way on the other side. So, well,
Sure.
JJ, you were really cool to come on. This was great, and like I said to readers, go get the book, man. The book's really good.
Thanks so much, Chuck. And yeah, man, more than a pleasure to talk to you, dude.